Okay, next, let's move on to the session on metrics, and it will be co-chaired by Daniela. And Daniela is the Make Data Count lead and a Sloan Foundation funded initiative focused on the development of open data metrics. And she's also the chair of the RDA data usage metrics working group. And in her other roles, she is the Dryad product manager and is a member of the UC Curation Center team at the California Digital Library and within the University of California. Daniela, please take away.
Thanks, Dawei. If we can begin the slides. It's great to chair the session. I'm going to kick it off with a little bit of an intro, and then we have three great speakers, and we'll have an hour for questions, and we'll bring Stephanie back in for that as well. So to kick this off, as Dawei mentioned, I lead a project called Make Data Count, a Sloan-funded initiative with DataCite, Data One, and California Digital Library, which intends to build the infrastructure for research data metrics. But I want to focus today to give a little bit of background on the landscape of current data metrics development work. And in short, I would say that we don't yet have data metrics, as Stephanie was just pointing out. But we have a bunch of community-led initiatives that have been building the building blocks for these, and I want to spend some time highlighting those. Next slide. So we've seen a big emphasis lately on research data by having these workshops, by creating policies, et cetera, and we often refer to credit as an incentive for data sharing. But we don't really have normalized approaches or meaningful ways to evaluate the reach of research data right now. And so without evaluation, we can't really have credit. Next slide. But we've seen large investments in the building blocks. And so here I'm showing an image of the progression that we've seen with the formation of persistent identifier organizations, the development of working groups and standards. And I just want to point out that the progression really begins with showing an emphasis on open scholarship in general with the Bermuda Principles, then the emphasis on research data, and now kind of working into these standards with 2016 forward. Next slide. Data are very complicated, and we often refer to data like we do with articles. We compare them, but data are much different than articles, and they're much less understood than articles. And so these differences are ones I want to briefly walk through because they're fundamental in why we don't yet have data metrics. But to begin, we can even say, how would all of us on this call define data? Probably differently. Next slide. So just briefly running through a couple of these differences. One is data set granularity. So data sets can be made up of multiple components from multiple places to form one data set. Next slide. There's also that data set can be derived. And so they can actually come from multiple published data sets amalgamated to form a new data set of new findings. We also have dynamic data where they're ever growing and ever changing because that is the nature of them. Next slide. And lastly, we can see that data sets are more commonly versioned than we do see for articles and other more traditional outputs. Next slide. And so if we're kind of taking that into consideration, we understand data usage, we could think about usage in this sense as the accesses of data and its metadata. And so there's two very base ways that we can look at this. One is views, which would be views of the metadata of the data set, or say it's a 3D model, and that would be seeing that view, or a download. And a download could be of the file or the data set itself. But one thing I want to point out before walking through some of these is that data use here does not imply reuse. It is merely just a count of the use of that data set. Next slide. So here's a couple of screenshots from some repositories that show data set views and downloads, very general repositories that I took these screenshots from. And are any of these numbers comparable? Next slide. They're not, because right now we don't actually know how these numbers are being calculated. It's not transparent. And so without a benchmark, we can't actually compare them. And beyond that, because they're from different fields, it wouldn't also be right for us to compare those as well. Next slide. So Make Data Count, as I mentioned, partnered with Counter, a standards organization, and we put together an outline for the first code of practice for research data. So Counter produces these for articles, and it's been the standards for books and journal articles and more traditional outputs. And we put together what we thought really encompassed some of these components that I previously mentioned, like versioning, but also further things like data are accessed by machines routinely where articles may not. And so we had to go through what's a good versus bad machine access, like bots. And so we put this out as a preprint in 2017 for a lot of public feedback. And then iterating on that, we published the first version in 2018. And so if you go through this, we can kind of see how we're able to eliminate things like possible gaming, like double clicking or inflating numbers by bots. And of course, we know gaming and other things can always happen, but this is really to put a little more trust and transparency in the numbers and have that benchmark. And we've seen that already when it's been processed on big repositories that have implemented. We've really seen the change in numbers and how much bots and others are inflating some of these view and download numbers. We've seen that in the repositories that implemented it, which are Dataverse, Data One, Dryad, Zenodo, and Caltech Data. Next slide. Just to talk really briefly, the data usage work is fairly new. And so I did want to introduce that. There is a working group at the Research Data Alliance, which began in 2013, if you're not familiar, to bring together folks all over the world to talk about various components of data sharing for the social and technical infrastructure with hundreds of working groups. And we formed a working group in 2017 called Data Usage Metrics. And that's really meant to bring in people to talk about different use cases. And so looking at atypical uses of data, looking at different types of accession numbers and ways that people are accessing biomed data. And we need really broad representation in these groups to actually be able to drive this forward. And so please consider joining that or get in touch with us after. Next slide. So data citation might be something that we're a little more familiar with, possibly a little more common. Next slide. And this is a depiction of how data citation can happen. We can see it in a couple of different ways. In an article, we see it as a data availability statement. We see it in the references or in the methods section, but we also see it in repositories or when a data set is referring to a past data set. But I want to focus a bit on how we actually got to the point of having data citations. And that's because we had community develop best practices, and has been that we've built on those and advocated for those and why we have a good standing for that. Next slide. So we've seen that various communities have cared about data citation. In 2010, CODATA, an international council, put out a data citation standards that they published in 2013. And in 2012, ESIP, an Earth Science organization, put out their data citation guidelines. So by 2014, FORCE put together the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles, building on these, and what followed was the Data Citation Implementation Framework that NIH was involved in as well. And because of this, we now have 120 organizations that have endorsed these principles and that have actually been building on them. Next slide. And while we as data centers and data repositories should be thinking about also displaying these linkages and citations, I want to spend a second to focus a little bit on the publisher side of things. So Scholix on the left here is a framework that came from RDA as well. And it's actually a protocol for how best to transfer this information that's saying an article and a data set are linked. But we like to say that Scholix is not actually a thing. It is an idea framework for how this can happen. And it really relies on Crossref, where journals are indexing their metadata and getting their DOIs. And to get these data citations to Crossref actually makes things discoverable. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because we actually have an adoption problem with this, where we're not seeing journals really pushing these through. And sometimes we see the opposite, where data citations are stripped. And so while it's really important that we all focus on having researchers cite their data, it's also important that we are working with the publishing community to also show them how essential it is for them to support this practice. Next slide. So I said that we were building on this. You can see here just some screenshots of other initiatives that are working on data citation. Recently, ESIP, as I had mentioned, put out a new version of their data guidelines. So I just wanted to spend some time to note that on the right here, we see Europe PMC has put in making these citations discoverable for their data sets that are indexed. You can see that on the right. And the folks at Elixir EBI have also been working on trying to find the impact metrics for omics data. And so we're kind of seeing how these community initiatives have driven more work in this space. Next slide. And so the biggest point that I want to drive with this is that there's a whole bunch of work underway for data usage, data citation, eventually looking at alt metrics and Twitter and others that Stephanie had mentioned. But a metric means meaning. And so while we can't even compare these numbers right now, we still need to be able to understand, are they comparable? We need to understand disciplinary differences, and all of these factors weigh into the point that we don't yet really have understood or meaningful data metrics. Next slide. And so I just want to walk very quickly through how that we can actually get there. It builds on a bit of what Stephanie mentioned. Next slide. The first is that we should all be participating. There is so much work going on in the usage and citation and other spaces in data metrics. And so we should all be supporting those initiatives, getting involved, bringing new use cases, and not trying to reinvent the wheel or restart these conversations. Next slide. The second is that it's really important we rely on transparent infrastructure so that we understand where these numbers have come from and don't fall into those traps that Stephanie had pointed out with the metrics that were formed before. Next slide. And then, of course, as Stephanie was mentioning, bibliometrics principle, we don't yet know what is meaningful for data yet. We also don't know specifically for fields. And so we don't want to prematurely assign any meaning to data right now just from the counts. Next slide. I would also add that it's essential that curation and peer review continue for research data. They're both required, but they're not the same thing. And so we can't actually say right now that any of these numbers that we have imply the scientific merit. And so we want to make sure that we're also factoring in qualitative assessment here. Next slide. And lastly, referring to Goodhart's law, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We need to understand that metrics change behavior, and we need to adapt and iterate with the researcher community as we start to see behavior changes when data metrics are developed. Next slide. And so how can we all get involved? It's important that we all start benchmarking outcomes. We promote best practice for how we're doing these baseline data usage, data citation. Join the conversation and present use cases if you don't feel like you work at a data resource that can be involved in this so that we can broaden the scope. And we should all be collaborating with broader research stakeholders like bibliometricians, informametrics, et cetera, to start actually building these open data metrics. Next slide. For more information on this and some visuals, we recently wrote a book. This is the book cover. This is where some of the images in my slide deck came from. If you're interested, it's at opendatametrics.org, and it's a free ebook. Next slide. And yeah, that's how I want to close that. So thank you for having me, and we will now transition on to the next speakers.